Okay, good morning, guys. So today we are looking at the beginning to Unit 3 Biology, Unit 3 Outcome 2. Although, as I said on Google Classroom, we will continue to look at some revision for photosynthesis and respiration as the end of Unit 3 Outcome 1 over these weeks as we go. So Unit 3 Outcome 2 focuses on the stimulus response model when applied to cells in terms of signal transduction. Okay, from that we'll go on to look at neurotransmitters and apoptosis as well, but that all comes down to the general idea of signaling and stimulus response. In a few weeks we'll also move on to look at the immune system, which is very relevant in these times that we live in, but for now we're just focusing on signals and stimulus and response in relation to our body. So this just talks about some general features of the internal and external environment and what that means in relation to our bodies. So the internal environment is the fluid between our cells. So our cells are constantly bathed in a fluid, and we call that interstitial fluid. And that's what we talk about when we talk about changes in the internal environment. It's typically changes that affect that fluid. The external environment is the environment outside of the organism. So the air temperature or water temperature or whatever, that's the external environment. As it says, the concentration of different substances all have an impact on the way that a cell functions. So the amount of glucose in the interstitial fluid or in the blood, the amount of oxygen, carbon dioxide, blood plasma, the concentration of those going up or down will impact the way that cells function. So organisms want to be able to regulate their internal conditions despite the changing conditions of the external environment. And they do this by moving materials across membranes. So this just shows you a diagram of some body tissue and the blood. And it's just showing you that you can see the sort of yellow shadings meant to indicate the interstitial fluid. And they're being kept separated by the capillary wall. So we don't really want our blood and our interstitial fluid to mix with one another, and we don't want fluids inside the cell and outside the cell to easily mix, and we've got the plasma membranes there for that. Okay, and just a reminder that homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively constant internal environment despite changes in the external environment. And many substances like oxygen, glucose, water levels as well need to be corrected when they rise too high or too low. And this formed a big part of Unit 1 Outcome 2, which the majority of you studied last year. Maybe have a look back on your notes on that if they're still there, but this is just really recap of that stuff. Just the idea that there's a negative feedback loop. So when something gets too high or too low, a signal goes to our control center, our brain, and that makes a response. So for example, if the temperature is too high, the response will be to reduce body temperature. And it may do that by lowering hairs on the skin to prevent air being trapped or something like that. Big part of it in year 11. This is just really a reminder of those things. Okay, this just overviews the stimulus response model. So the idea is there's a stimulus or a signal that's some sort of change in the environment. Could be physical or chemical, could be internal or external. Receptors receive that signal. Information goes to our communication system involving our brain and our spine, and then that goes through our nervous system and endocrine system. Effectors will initiate a response, which could be to either move a muscle or to release a hormone, and then there is some sort of response as a result of that. This just overviews types of signal. So there's physical stimuli like light, heat, and pressure. There are chemical stimuli like nutrient levels. Then you also have your hormones, neurotransmitters and pheromones, which we'll all look at as part of this topic. And then we will have a look at, and then there's electrical signals as well. The table on the right just overviews the difference between the nervous system and endocrine system. So the nervous system is a system of specialised cells providing rapid and precise signalling between parts of the organisms, whereas the endocrine system is chemical messengers, basically hormones, that are transmitted to a target cell. The nervous system is far faster than the endocrine system, and the nervous system is electrical, whereas the endocrine system is chemical. So when we're talking about signal transduction, that's basically talking about how a signal gets ultimately passed to where it's doing its role. So there are three major things that needs to happen. The signal needs to be received by receptors of the cell. Transduction needs to occur, where information from the receptor is passed on to an effector, and there needs to be a response where something happens as a result of that. Okay? And we're mostly interested in step 2, which is looking at how the information gets passed along. So this is just showing you an example of signal transduction. The yellow dots are the messenger, and the sort of orange Y-shaped thing is the receptor. So the receptor binds with the messenger. As it does so, that activates secondary messengers in the cell, and the secondary messengers will relay the message to the nucleus of the cell, which will do something as response. That could be to transcribe a gene. It could be to transcribe an enzyme to digest something. It could be to release a hormone. It could be to undergo apoptosis. But some sort of response occurs as a result of that. Okay. This is another example. So again, the signaling molecule is binding to the receptor. It is then being transduced along secondary messengers, and then that ultimately gets to the nucleus, which does some sort of response. And you'll notice that's saying with a membrane receptor. So many receptors are found on the cell membrane, and that's useful when the messenger, the signaler, the hormone, whatever you want to call it, that's useful when that can't pass through the cell membrane. However, some molecules, signaling molecules, can move through the cell membrane, and that's just showing you this on this diagram. So the orange blob is the hormone, a steroid hormone. The purple blob with the gap in it is the receptor. So the hormone is passing through the cell membrane. That's step 1. It's passing into the receptor. So they then join together as a hormone receptor complex. And from there, they move to the nucleus, where they make the nucleus do some sort of response. So this is different from the other one, where the signal and receptor meet on the outside, and then the receptor activates secondary messengers. This is different as the signal actually goes into the cell, it binds to the receptor, and it moves to the nucleus from there. So reception, the first stage of it, we put there, it's quite similar to recognition of an enzyme for its substrate. So the signal molecules, sometimes called the ligand, and the receptor protein have a complementary shape to one another. So they can fit together quite well. So whether that's on the cell membrane or in the cell, they have a complementary shape. So the receptor and the signaling molecule, the ligand, bind together. A receptor protein has a structure a bit like this. This is one on the cell membrane. So the signal binding site there that you can see on the right-hand top level of it, that will be complementary to the signal it interacts with. The loop at the bottom that says segment that interacts with G proteins, that's what will set off the secondary messengers in the cell. So the signal binds, then the segment, and then when it binds, that activates the bit at the bottom to activate secondary messengers. So in the transduction stage, when the receptor changes shape, that will result in secondary messengers being activated in the cell. And that could result in, those secondary messengers could be enzymes being activated, it could be just other molecules that pass the signal along, anything like that, just something that passes the signal along through the cell. The response is usually some type of cellular activity, like an enzyme action, or the cytoskeleton changing, or a channel protein opening, or a gene being transcribed. Apoptosis may be an action as a result of it. But basically, due to the transduction of the signal, the cell does something. That's the key thing. What I'd like you to do is, using the slides, have a go at making a flow diagram to show the stages of signal transduction, having a minimum of 2 boxes per stage. I'll put an example one onto Google Classroom later, and also have a go at this exam style question. Again, I'll put the answers onto Google Classroom later. I also want you to watch the Ed Rolo video on this, and like I say, I'll be accessible via email all the way through this lesson. Okay, thank you.